Gustafson.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to apologize in advance if I sound a little bit froggy. I've been battling bronchitis for about 3 weeks, and yeah, that was why I almost didn't make it. So I may cough a little bit, and I may sound a little bit like Tom Waits, but we'll get through it. So yeah, I'm Aaron Gustafson. I kind of come from a web standards background. I used to be one of the managers of WASP, the Web Standards Project, and now I get to work on web standards and accessibility at Microsoft, which is a heck of a lot of fun. Now, I've been working on the web for about 2 decades, which means I'm old. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that building for the web is hard. Now, back when I started out, things were pretty simple. We had screens that were like 640 by 480 pixels, pretty tiny little windows to the web, and that was pretty much how most people accessed the web in terms of screen dimensions. Eventually, monitors started getting a little bit bigger. We got those 600 by 800 screens, which was pretty amazing. And then eventually, things kind of settled around 1024 by 768. And that was comfortable. We kind of sat there for a while. People started having a little bit wider designs and such. Of course, laptops were around too, and they had widely ranging screen sizes. Some were in the 800 by 600 range or 1024 by 600, and spread all the way up to 1366 by 768. But not that many people at the time were really using laptops. Most people were viewing the web on a desktop device. So we kind of felt like we were in this happy place of 1024 by 768. Unfortunately, we were kind of ignoring what was happening in the mobile space, where we would have screens that were 240 by 240 pixels or 640 by 200, really tiny, tiny screens. And those tended to be on really crappy mobile devices, and people tended to have really crappy web experiences on those devices, if they had any web experience at all. Some of you may remember some of the, I think it was MobilityNet used to do conversions of big corporate sites over to like just plain text for mobile and made WAP stuff and things like that. But the mobile web was pretty crappy overall. So we kind of ignored that until the iPhone came out, and suddenly people were able to have kind of this first-class experience on a portable device. And now, we have mobile devices, smartphones that range everywhere from 320 by 480 all the way up to 3840 by 2160 in terms of screen resolution. So that's a widely varying amount of space to work with. And tablets are even more all over the place. They're just kind of crazy. I don't know if any of you ever used some of the early Android devices, but you would have like a 7-inch tablet that would not only have its standard screen resolution, but you could set 5 different font sizes for the device. And then you could also set 3 different zoom modes in terms of how far you were holding it from your face. So that's a matrix of 15 different screen dimensions on one device. And then you had portrait and landscape. So you had 30 different screen dimensions that you might possibly have to accommodate on a single Android device, which was just nuts. Of course, we could always go back to desktop, and it could be really simple, right? We have a range of like 1920 up to 78 or 7680 by 4320. That's an 8K monitor. Some of those are starting to show up now. Good Lord. So looking at all of this, it becomes clear that chasing screen size is a fool's errand, right? We don't want to choose how we design something based purely on specific fixed sizes, because there is no fixed size for the web. And this was really driven home to me when I read a blog post in 2012, and it was updated later in 2014, where this gentleman, Jason Samuels, looked at their Google Analytics stats for an organization called the National Council on Family Relations, which is it's kind of an NGO organization that works on or that supports people who are doing research into how families work together. And over the 4 and then later a 6-year period, he was looking at various things like screen size that people were using to access their site. And in 2008, they only had about 71 different screen resolutions. But in the first quarter of 2014, they had 1,062 different screen resolutions that accessed their pages, which is just kind of baffling. And of course, there's going to be a long tail there, right? But even if you took it to, and so just for context, 2008, that's the year after the iPhone, and 2014 is 3 years ago. So that's like a forever in terms of the web. So as I said, there's a long tail, but even if you brought it down to only things that only screen sizes that had 10 visits or more, it was about 27 in 2008, different screen resolutions, and 200 in 2014. So there's a lot of variability in terms of the sizes of screens that people were using or continue to use to access the web. So chasing screen size is a fool's errand. And I think you could say that designing for screens is hard, but that's only one part of what we deal with when we're thinking about how our sites need to reach users. Screen variability is only just one tiny factor. There are all of these other things that we have to think about. I haven't even mentioned some of the other places that our content can go to. It can go to wearables, it can go to IoT devices, it can go to smart televisions, it can go to digital assistants, things that don't even have screens. Our content can go there. Right? And it's starting to happen more and more. We're starting to see digital assistants connected to web browsers and able to give people access to the web. And in those scenarios, people need to use different interaction methods. Now, most of us are fairly familiar with mouse-based interaction, touch-based interaction. Hopefully, most of you are doing keyboard-based interaction as well, both for assistive technology reasons, but also for power users. And then there are a ton of other ways that people use to access and interact with content on the web, whether that's T9 entry, whether that's a remote control or a pen. They might use a touch feedback device to provide them with real-time braille. They might be using eye tracking, or they might be using a gamepad, those sorts of things. And all of those have different needs that are associated with them from an input standpoint. And then, of course, as Ali told us yesterday, there's all of these things we have to be concerned with in terms of networks and how people are accessing our content. And all of that can vary as well, from a fixed hardwire to Wi-Fi to mobile connections. Some of those can be in homes and in offices, buildings, cars, buses, trains, planes. All of these places have great variability in terms of how content is able to reach our users. And all of these are factors that we need to be thinking about and that we need to be considering when we're building for the web. And then, of course, there's the actual users themselves, right? All of our users have different needs as well, and their needs can be a permanent need that they have for accessing content. It could be something that's more transitional or temporary, rather, or could be purely situational. I'll get into that in a moment. But all of these needs that they have for accessing our content affect the experience that they're going to have, and we need to be able to kind of account for that and accommodate that. And you'll notice that I haven't even mentioned browser variability, right? So all of that stuff that we have to be concerned with as well. I mean, it's a lot better than it used to be back in the day. We have pretty good parity between browsers. But it's still something that we need to be concerned about. Is an API available? Is it not available? What have you? So how do we cope with this? It's a pretty crazy thing that we do every day when we sit down to create web pages. There's so many factors to consider in this. But the reality is that nothing about our user's experience has ever been homogeneous, even though at a certain point in my career, it felt very safe to assume that somebody had a mouse and that they were on 1024 on a desktop. That was never really the case, because there were always factors that were influencing how somebody was able to access that content. And we needed to be creating more flexible designs even back then. So the debates over fluid design versus fixed width and stuff like that were raging. And in many ways, the web design challenges that we have today are really deeply related to the web design challenges that we had back then. All of the concern that we have over mobile networks and their high latency or slow throughput, that relates very closely to what we were dealing with dial-up when we had to deal with 28.8 modems and that sort of stuff, and we had to think about how our images were being loaded and being really cognizant of how big those files were, how many resources we were requesting, all of that sort of stuff. image optimization and color density. I don't know how many of you have the luxury of looking at stuff on a bunch of different monitors or a bunch of different mobile devices, but colors can vary widely from device to device and monitor to monitor. Greens especially blow out on certain devices, especially cheaper Android devices. You can end up with this green that just almost like burns into your retina. And so there's all of these different things that we have to deal with. Most of us have nice color calibrated monitors probably at our desks, or Apple laptops or high-end laptops. That's not the case with a lot of people who are accessing our content. And then as we've been concerned with screen readers and other forms of assistive technology over the years, that assistive technology is really the same assistive technology that we're starting to see as digital assistants. The word assistant is still in there, and they're very deeply related to one another in terms of how they access content and make it available for people. Now, the reality is that the web can go anywhere that there's even a temporary internet connection. So obviously that means cities, certainly, although if you're on a mobile network, you can end up in sort of digital canyons or signal canyons within or between buildings where all of a sudden you lose signal. But as Ali reminded us yesterday, in developing nations, there are a lot of people who are accessing content and need to be able to access content on the web as well. This gentleman happens to have the fancy iPhone in India. But he might be using a fancy device on a not so stellar network, right? And some folks are still using feature phones or cheaper smartphones that have access to the web. I picked one up at, in the States we have a department store called Target, and I picked up a pay-as-you-go phone from this company, TrackPhone, and it was a smartphone, it was a touch screen, and it had a virtual keyboard, and that virtual keyboard was T9. So T9 data entry on a virtual keyboard. Could you imagine how painful that would be to enter web addresses? It's horrible, horrible, horrible. And then, of course, there's the most hostile network connection available, hotel Wi-Fi. True story, I was in Silicon Valley for a conference at the time that they announced the Retina iPad. And I was attempting to pull up the promotional page on apple.com to view that on hotel Wi-Fi. It took 30 minutes to load. 30 minutes to load. Why does things like this happen? Why do we create these kind of horrible experiences? Well, often it's because we're designing for other people like us. We are, in most cases, I'm going to make a broad generalization, we are in most cases more well off. We have access to nicer technology than the vast majority of people on this planet, and more stable network connections, and so on and so forth. And it's important to recognize that experience is not a singular thing. Our experience is not universal. Not everybody accesses content the same way we do, on the same devices, on the same networks, in the same modalities that we do. And when we design the web in the way that we experience it, we actually limit the way that other people can experience it. So we end up excluding other people who are not like us. And that's not great. When we design inclusively, we actually create better experiences for more people. So when we create an experience for someone who is not like us, we can even have unintended audiences that we end up creating better experiences for. So I'll give a physical real-world example of curb cuts. Curb cuts and sidewalks were originally created in order to facilitate people in wheelchairs being able to make it more easily across the street. But they also help people in a wide range of other circumstances too. So that could be kids riding bicycles, it could be parents pushing strollers, or workers hauling heavy equipment. And similarly, high contrast settings were initially made to help people who have vision impairments. But today, many people benefit from those when they're using, let's say, their mobile device in bright sunlight, being able to turn up the contrast in order to be able to see it. Whereas if we design like a medium gray text on a light gray background so that there's not a whole lot of contrast in our design, that becomes really hard to read if you have to view it outdoors, or if you're trying to conserve battery life on your phone and you turn the brightness down. So the more that we kind of design with the constraints of different users and their different experiences, the more we design with that in mind, the better experiences we create for more people. So when we design for somebody, let's say, with a permanent disability, somebody who has a situational disability or a temporary disability can also benefit. So in this case, we have somebody who has one arm. When we design an experience that's going to work well for that person with one arm, somebody who has a broken wrist will be able to benefit from that as well. And somebody who might be holding a baby also benefits from that, and that's a situational impedance. And kind of being mindful of that continuum of experience helps us to kind of scale our designs to reach more people. So in the US, about 26,000 people a year lose the use of an upper extremity. And when we add that number, which doesn't sound like a huge number, I mean, it seems significant, but I mean, in the grand scale of things, 26,000 people is probably not that much. The number of people who break an arm in the US is about 13 million a year. And then the number of people who are new parents is about 8 million a year in the US. So you end up with about 21 million people that benefit from the experience that you created for somebody who is missing an upper extremity. So the ripples can be really big. So how do we make our interfaces more adaptive? I'm going to take a drink first, but then we'll take a look at an example here. So we'll start with kind of a common thing that we see on the web. This is a content teaser, let's say on a news site, where it has an image, and then it has the title, maybe the section of the newspaper that it's in, and it also has kind of a little blurb introducing the content. It's got the author, the date line, and in this case, it's also got a Facebook like button, but we'll kind of come back to that in a moment. If we break this down, the essential nugget of content is that intro teaser, the title of the article, the teaser text to get somebody into it, because the purpose of this is to intrigue somebody to click the link to read the full article, right? That's the whole purpose of this thing. The image is nice to have. It's not necessary, but it can be useful for drawing the eye to a particular article, especially if you've got a very busy page where there's a lot of competition for somebody's attention. But it's not essential to the core experience of this particular piece. And then you've got the Facebook like button, which honestly is superfluous and fairly expensive from a performance standpoint. It's also got some privacy issues that you might want to consider. But really, if we were to boil this down to the nut meat, kind of the minimum viable interface, what we would have is that title and the intro text, the lead, as it were, and maybe the category, the section of the site that it lives in. And if we think about this in terms of the amount of screen real estate available, as we enlarge the screen, as we have more real estate available to us, we might bring in stuff like the author information, which is kind of secondary. Chances are, unless it's like a really small paper or you're dealing with a really famous writer, most people probably don't care as much about the writer as they do about the content of the story. So maybe we bring that in as a secondary thing when we have enough space for it. And then on a large screen, we just keep allowing the content to stretch until it reaches sort of a maximum comfortable line length in terms of characters. So in this scenario, we can actually, if we want, in kind of our ideal scenario, we want to have that image in there, we could use a technique like lazy loading to bring that image in within certain scenarios, and I'll break that down in a few minutes. And maybe we can get rid of the Facebook like button altogether because it's really unnecessary. And honestly, I have a real problem with people who put like buttons on teasers like this, as well as people who put like share this content right after the title of the article. You haven't read the article yet. Like, why would you want to share it? You don't know if it's good. That stuff should be at the end if you've even got it at all. All right, so our new ideal is having the image there if we can, and then we've got our content blurb and no Facebook stuff. Now, how do we plan an adaptive design like this? I'm going to walk through eight steps for accomplishing this. So the first thing that we need to do is when we're looking at a component or even a page for that matter, we should be looking at it and asking ourselves, what is the purpose of this page? What is the purpose of this component? What does it need to do, right? Because otherwise, what's the point? If it doesn't have a purpose, it shouldn't be there, right? So in our case, in this particular instance, the purpose of it is that nugget, that essential nugget of content in the teaser. So the headline and the introductory text. The second step would be to write it out and then read it back to yourself. The reading it back is actually a really important part. We should be focusing on how our interfaces read and think about the role that design is playing in how we're kind of consuming that content, how somebody who's a sighted user is consuming that content. What sort of content hierarchy are they getting from the visual design? Because in a lot of cases, we're getting a visual design of a component, and then we're having to go and create that in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So we need to be thinking about how do those visuals translate to non-visual content, in some cases content that might be even not shown, but you want to be spoken by a screen reader or a digital assistant or such. So is there anything that the design is conveying that should be spelled out to non-visual users? And this becomes the accessible core of your component or of your interface. Now, back in 2011, Facebook was tweaking their photo reporting tool. This is where you would put in that this particular photo is offensive or something like that, and you want Facebook to remove it. And they introduced a question, which was, how does this photo make you feel? And the options they provided were embarrassing, upsetting, saddening, bad photo, and other with a fill in the blank. Now, this worked pretty well. About 50% of the people who reported it answered the new question when they introduced it with the provided options, which was great, but 34% of the people who responded other wrote it's embarrassing in the blank rather than choosing the embarrassing option. So clearly the content, the way this was written, didn't actually resonate with the users, or at least 34% of the users who responded other. The fact that they had used an implied it's was creating this disconnect. People maybe thought that Facebook was asking if they were embarrassing. I don't know. So they actually changed this, and they rephrased the question to please describe the photo. It's embarrassing. It's a bad photo of me. It makes me sad. And what they found is that they were actually able to increase the percentage of photo reporters who chose one of the options to about 78%. So it was all about thinking about how this content, and something as mundane as a forum, right? They were able to think about how this content read and how people were able to, how it was able to resonate with them and how they were able to better interact with it. The next step is to actually look for semantics in HTML that support the first two steps. So choosing elements for their meaning. So if we go back to our example of the content teaser, we would use some form of a heading element for the title of the article. We would have an anchor, obviously, to link that article or link to the full version of the article. Paragraph is a great thing to use for the actual paragraph content. We have the image element, obviously. You could use the time element from HTML5 for the date information. And then we could even take it a step further and use something like microformats to add classes that actually provide additional information. So if you're not familiar with microformats, in most cases, it's class names, sometimes it's rel attributes, that provide more information about the content that's on the screen. So in this case, I can say that this is an H entry, which is part of a feed of content. So in other words, you can make an HTML page act like an Atom feed or an RSS feed. And that feed item has specific parts of it. So P name is for the title, URL is the URL of that item in the feed. UPhoto is the photo that's associated with that feed item, P summary for the summary, and then DT published for the published date of it. And then for the author, who is P author, you could also use an HCard class in order to indicate that this is a person. And you could have their contact information and stuff like that. You can get really granular with this. And there are tools that are able to actually consume this information, whether it's converting an HTML page into something like an Atom feed or being able to extract somebody's contact information from a page. There are a lot of really interesting uses for microformats. Additionally, and this is somewhat of a tangent, but additionally, you could look into using something like JSON LD to make your content more shareable. or make it able to be more readily syndicated. This is just using the JSON JavaScript object notation to capture the information about the content in order to expose it to bots and such. So a little bit of an extra. The next step would be to think about how color, proportion, and white space can be used to improve the visual comprehension of the page. Hopefully, whoever has designed the component has thought about this. They've thought about how to make the title more prominent, make the content less prominent, find ways to kind of disambiguate the section that this article may appear in, and such, in order to make it a little bit more obvious to a sighted user what's important and what's not important. Excuse me. And then we also need to be, I talked about writing your content and then reading it back to yourself and thinking about that, but we also need to think about how the design that we use, that we create, the designs that we create, affect the reading experience for people who are sighted as well. Because there are a lot of things that we can do in a design that actually can ultimately undermine the accessibility of our content, even for sighted users. So this is an example from YouTube of Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. And in this particular mobile screen, the title of the different video clips includes the name of the show. And because the name of the show is so long, you don't actually see the title of the episode or what that clip is about in the screen. So that becomes a not very useful interface, right? We can't tell what those different things are. And a lot of times the screenshot that you get isn't very helpful either. In another example, we have really awkward wrapping. I'm sure some of you have seen this where an image has been floated to one side or another and you end up with a really weird break. Sometimes you end up with like 2 letters, a hyphen, and then like 15 lines later, the rest of the word. That's a really bad reading experience. So we want to avoid those as much as possible, which is why it's important that we test on a wide variety of screen sizes and that we be kind of considerate of how we're laying out our content by thinking about what that reading experience is like. The next step is to think about how people may need to interact with our pages. Now, I talked about some of the different interaction methods, the different input methods that people have for working or interacting with the web. I just want to kind of briefly touch on some of the common paradigms that we use for interaction, like hover. Hover is only really functions in a couple of scenarios. It can function in things like eye tracking. It functions obviously with mouse, and some touch scenarios, hover will work, sometimes not. Things like focus and target only operate within certain input methods. A couple more, which is nice. They tend to be really useful with assistive tech and with sort of limited input tools like a gamepad or a remote. Those can be really useful. And then we've got gestures that are only available in certain scenarios, only sometimes with mice. Some browsers have supported gestures, like Opera supported gestures for years. And there are plugins that enable that in Chrome and such. But gestures are mostly used in touch and maybe in pen scenarios as well. We're starting to see it a bit more in mixed modal devices, like some of the Windows Surface devices that have a touch screen as well as a trackpad and a pen and all of that stuff. So we are seeing more gesture support on laptops and larger screens too. And then things like text expansions can be also really useful, and those only apply in certain scenarios. They might be useful in a print scenario to print out the URL that a link points to. Because somebody has printed out the document and may want to reference where that link points later on. Text expansion can also be really useful in an audio context or in a Braille touch feedback context as well. So we need to be kind of aware of how some of our interaction and our design decisions impact those different input methods and output methods for that matter. And then we should really be looking to map out those experiences. So this is where I think flowcharts are extremely useful. They're kind of boring, but they can be really great for helping you to figure out where your interaction should have a delta, have a change. So there's kind of some standard conventions to how to do flowcharts for this sort of things. There's diamonds for decision points. There's parallelograms, or is that trapezoid? I don't remember. But anyway, there's that for making changes and that sort of stuff. But really, they're just a bunch of lines and arrows and such, right? So these are the 7 steps. Focus on what matters, write it out, then read it back. Look for semantics that support numbers 1 and 2. Think about how design can improve comprehension. Consider how your design choices impact the reading experience. Think about the many different ways that people can interact with your content, and then map those potential experiences out. And then the 8th one, because I mentioned there was 8, is to iterate on that, to just do that cycle over and over again to continually refine your experiences. And really, this ends up being progressive enhancement, to think about the core experience, a baseline user experience that works universally. And then as you have the capability to create a better and better experience, that you go ahead and do so. Christian Heilman made the astute observation that Mitch Hedberg was actually a progressive enhancement fan. And he said, I like an escalator because an escalator can never break, it only becomes stairs. So you can still get from one floor to the other, as opposed to like an elevator, which if an elevator breaks, you're going to have to find the stairs, right? It becomes just kind of a wasted box. So progressive enhancement at its core is a philosophy aimed at crafting experiences that serve your users and that give them access to content without putting any sort of technological restrictions on them or making assumptions about the sort of things that they need in order to access something. And it will help you to create more resilient experiences that, let's say, work if a ISP decides to block jQuery or whatever your JavaScript library is, or somebody happens to be on hotel Wi-Fi and it takes them forever to download something. Or maybe they're on a device that has only a finite amount of disk space or RAM and they can't load your page. This happened on a BlackBerry device during the Obama for America, the first run. The page was 3 megs and the device just ran out of space. I don't know if any of you have ever seen a 413 error, but that's what it is. So it's about starting with what matters and then building out from there. That's ultimately what progressive enhancement's about. So I'll do a quick shameless plug. If you're interested in reading my book, Adaptive Web Design, you can read the first edition for free, or you can pick up the second edition, which is out from New Writers. So let's get into a couple more examples, because I've only got about 7 minutes left, so hopefully I can get through both of these. I'm going to return to the content teaser piece, because I want to talk about the lazy loading and how we might approach this, and how we might map this out, since I think this is kind of important. So in terms of building out an interface, the first thing that happens when any interface is being created is we have a load event. And that load event could be taking place from the server. It could potentially be taking place from the user's cache. It could be coming from a service worker. Where it comes from doesn't really matter. The first delta that we really have to deal with, since lazy loading requires JavaScript, is whether or not JavaScript is executing. Somebody may have JavaScript, but maybe a plugin is interrupting something, or maybe an ISP is blocking it, or there's a number of things that can cause JavaScript to just not run. So we shouldn't make assumptions that it's available, which is why server-side rendering is so important. If there is no JavaScript, in this case, the experience will be that there won't be an image, and that's okay. The image is not critical to the experience of this content teaser. Somebody can still learn about what this article talks about and decide whether or not they want to read the article. So it is perfectly acceptable. However, if they do have JavaScript, we could do something like verify the browser width and determine whether it makes sense to load the image or not, right? If the browser width is such that, let's say, it's the same size as the image and we want to float the image to the left or something like that, that's going to be a poor reading experience, so maybe we just don't want to load the image unless we have at least double the image width of screen real estate to deal with. So not big enough, we're just going to keep it as no image. And then if it is big enough, sorry, that's a quick display of what that might look like. If JavaScript is available and there is enough space to insert the image in, then we can go ahead and adjust the markup, add some, or apply some CSS to it, and display that image. So we end up with the image being loaded in. So how this ends up shaking out in terms of actual code. In this case, we've got a div with the class. Let's see if this actually works up there. There we go. Div with the class of entry image. And it's got a data attribute of the image source that we want to show. And then when JavaScript runs, so this actually would take up no space because divs are collapsed. They're still a block level element, but they don't take up any space by themselves, so that's not going to hurt anything if our CSS doesn't apply. But then when JavaScript is able to run, it can add a data attribute that says that the image has been loaded. So data has image equals true, and then it goes ahead and it injects in the image that we want to have in there. And we could go further and dynamically inject alt attributes and all of that sort of stuff too. I'm trying to keep this example a little bit more simple. And in this case, I don't think the teaser image really needs to have alt text because it's really just presentational. From a CSS standpoint, anything that has an attribute of data image source, we're going to set that to display none by default. So those divs will not appear. But then when data image loaded attribute gets added to it, then we can display it Bloq. Okay, so fairly simple CSS to make that happen. Don't worry if you don't grok JavaScript. Basically, this is just a quick function that can check. Ooh, that's weird. Okay, faded out and faded back in. This just checks to see, basically it watches resize events in the browser and it makes sure that it kind of throttles them. So if somebody is slowly resizing the browser, it only fires once at the end of the resize as opposed to every millisecond or what have you. It also fires when people rotate a device from portrait to landscape, which is kind of nice. So this is just the basic code in order to be able to fire that. And then we could do things like, let's say we want to track what the browser width is in a global variable and then reference that from other functions. I could do that by supplying a callback function to that watch resize event. And then for my actual component, I can set a threshold. In this case, I'm setting a threshold of, oops, back up here. Setting a threshold of 400 up there. And then I can verify that against the browser width condition, which is right there. And if that browser width condition is met, so I've got more than 400 pixels wide, then I can go ahead and lazy load the image. I also have some extra code in there that will check to see if the image has already been loaded so it doesn't load the image twice. But that goes ahead and gives us the experience that we were looking for the lazy loading. We could then take that a step further and make this sort of a live check. So as somebody is resizing the browser, we can show or hide the image. And the cool thing is that, so if we're in a scenario where somebody is on, let's say, a 7-inch tablet, so a very widescreen tablet, and they're looking at it in landscape mode, and they turn it to portrait, and all of a sudden it's not going to be a good reading experience to have that image in there. We've already lazy loaded the image, if JavaScript's available, but we want to present the most, the best reading experience to our users. So we can actually just rely on CSS in order to accomplish the hiding of that image, since we've already incurred the penalty of downloading it. And instead of just having those two data attributes create the display Bloq CSS, we can put that inside of a media query, and now all of a sudden when that media query is not activated, the image won't be displayed either. So we don't even need to involve JavaScript in order to make that a live switching back and forth between portrait and landscape. So, and this is, again, assuming that you're using like a 400 pixel width. You'd want to match those up. There's other ways to actually pass information between CSS and JavaScript to get them on the same page, so you're not having to track the same width in multiple places. But this is just a simple example to show how to do that. So ultimately what we end up with is we move from small to larger to largest. And when we come back down from the larger screen, the image, if it has been lazy loaded, disappears again, so that we create that best potential experience. All right, got one more interface I want to show you, and I've only got 1 minute and 22 seconds, so I'm going to run a few minutes over. I apologize. So I want to look at a tabbed interface because this is a much more complicated example of how we interact with things. So the purpose of a tabbed interface is to basically chunk out content to make it possible for somebody to kind of look at something within a specific context. So in this case, it's a recipe for pumpkin pie. It's got the overview tab. It's got an ingredients tab. It's got a directions tab, and then a nutrition tab. You wouldn't necessarily need all of that information at once, so it might make sense to view this in something like a tabbed interface. Now, the kind of age-old approach to doing this would be to have all of the tabbed interface related markup, so an unordered list maybe for the tabs, and then to have div wrappers for the content sections and such. But when you do stuff like this, we often run into a scenario where maybe the JavaScript isn't available, or stops running for some reason, and you've got something that looks like a tabbed interface but actually can't interact like a tabbed interface. I don't know if any of you have ever experienced that, but it can be really frustrating as a user. So a cleaner approach would be to actually just indicate that some content could be turned into a tabbed interface or could be chunked out in some way. So maybe we put a wrapper around the overall recipe and then could pay attention to things like heading levels, which create a natural document outline, and use those as indicators for what the tabs could be and what those section contents would be in order to generate the tabbed interface from it. So the baseline experience, maybe with just a little bit of CSS applied to it, would be a linear pumpkin pie recipe with the introduction and then the ingredients and so on and so forth, which is fine. So we have load, and then if JavaScript's not available, we have that linear experience that I just showed you where it would even print perfectly like this as well. So that's a perfectly usable recipe. But if JavaScript is available, we could go ahead and split the content dynamically based on those heading levels. We could make the tabs from them. We could assign all of the event handlers for both mice and for keyboards, or for touch events and so on and so forth in order to make sure that this interface is usable by people, and then we end up with our tabbed interface. So that's ultimately what we want, right? From a markup standpoint, we go from having the tabbed interface wrapper to having all of that markup that we would potentially have traditionally put in the markup to begin with, but now all of that's being injected via JavaScript dynamically when we know the tab interface can actually be created and run. And so all of the IDs can be dynamically assigned. All of the ARIA stuff that I'm going to talk about in a moment can be dynamically assigned and controlled. And then we can add this tab interface enabled class or something similar to act as a trigger to turn on all of the styles to make it look like a tabbed interface. So we've got essentially a switch within CSS to make that happen. Now the neat thing about IX maps is because it's a flowchart, because anybody can really contribute to these, and because they're so cheap to make, they're really easy to modify and to continue to iterate on. That's one of the reasons that I like them so much. So we could do something like verify whether or not there's space for tabs. Maybe we go ahead and dynamically check what the width of the tabs would be if we stuck them all side by side within our design, and then check to see if there's enough space to actually have those. Because maybe you're dealing with a German website where the words are fairly long, and you know what? Those tabs probably are not going to fit nicely horizontally, and no one wants to have scrolling horizontal tabs. I've seen them, they're awful. So we can verify the width and see how much width is available. And if there's not enough space, maybe we build an accordion instead, because that accomplishes, it meets that same core concept of showing and hiding content based on the context that you want. So we could do that as an alternative. Or we could iterate even further. Maybe we want to, or we could test that live, yeah. But maybe we could take that even further, and we could test within that width condition to see whether the details and summary elements, which were introduced in HTML5, whether those are available. If those are available, maybe we inject those so that we get a native accordion. But if not, then we can fall back to a pure JavaScript accordion. And then we could take things even further by adding ARIA into these different experiences. So within the tab scenario, maybe we go ahead and create a breakout here. And if somebody has ARIA and is using assistive technology that makes use of ARIA, then we can go ahead and create an experience that has audio cues in it as well. So ARIA has a bunch of roles that are associated with tabbed interfaces and such, like tab list, tabs. You can indicate which things are controlled by other elements, whether certain things are selected, whether certain things are hidden or visible, and so on and so forth. And taken all together, you would end up with an experience like this, which is from NVDA and Firefox. So that's a pretty cool experience for somebody who's using assistive technology like a screen reader. And it's worth noting that those of you who could see that there was a mismatch between what was being spoken by the screen reader, there was a little bit of a lag between that and the actual interaction. That's because I had the voice slowed down so that those of you who aren't used to screen readers could understand it a little bit easier. But But yeah, that's a pretty adaptive experience that we can create there. And all of it starts with just kind of mapping out what those different potential experiences are, looking for different places that we can create a delta and build a unique experience that accommodates somebody who has a particular special need. So my time is more than up at this point, but I sincerely hope you walk away with this with maybe a little bit broader perspective of what the web can be and how different folks can interact with it. And armed with that knowledge, I do believe that together we can make the web a little bit better every day. Thank you all very much.